Muy buenos días a todos. A nombre de la SFP Capítulo México, les damos la gran bienvenida. Las indicaciones generales, como siempre, les solicitamos silenciar sus micrófonos, apagar cámaras. Pueden enviar sus preguntas y mensajes al chat y al final de la conferencia tendremos la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. También están disponibles el correo electrónico contacto@sfpmexicocharter.org en el que nos pueden llegar sus sugerencias y comentarios. El día de hoy vamos a tener a la ponente, la doctora Helen Underheim, con el tema Fire Safety and Education from Associate and Critical Perspective. Posterior a ese tendremos una sesión de preguntas y al final la clausura. Como misión objetivos de la SFP en México, tenemos el de promover el uso de las mejores prácticas de ingeniería, fomentando la educación y capacitación de la seguridad contra incendios en la sociedad, con los siguientes 3 objetivos: el de fomentar el uso de la normativa nacional e internacional en la sociedad y en especialistas en protección contra incendios, así como la profesionalización de personas en la ingeniería contra incendios en México, y el de difundir la cultura de la protección contra incendios. A continuación, presentamos a nuestra conferencista del día de hoy, la doctora Helen Underhill. Ella es investigadora y profesional educativa en la seguridad contra incendios, a través de pedagogías críticas, feministas y metodologías post-cualitativas. Helen obtuvo financiamiento de la Academia Británica para investigar género, riesgo de incendios y las posibilidades de educación sobre incendios en asentamientos informales en el Líbano. Muy bien, Helen, te damos la gran bienvenida y te dejamos el espacio. Adelante.
Buenos dias, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today and for welcoming me. And also to Sandra, who has been so open to me to talking about education and my thoughts about how a social and critical perspective can help us to think about fire safety education in a different way. She's also helping me by sharing slides today. So thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you to everybody here. I really appreciate your time, and I really welcome the opportunity to talk more about how we can try these approaches to fire safety education on a bigger scale. Please do tell me if I'm talking too quickly. I get a bit excited when I talk about education and pedagogy. So please use the chat to ask questions. Sandra has said that she will help with translating those for me. And Sandra, send me a WhatsApp if I'm talking too quickly or if I need to explain anything again. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come and listen, and I hope that you'll enjoy the session and take the opportunity to talk about how you've been using fire safety education yourself, and what we can learn together. So next slide. So the first thing is to just say, who am I and how did I end up here talking to you about fire safety education? So my name is Helen Underhill. I live in Manchester in the UK, and I call myself an educator and a researcher. My background is teaching English literature and language in high schools, and I've worked in teacher education and in professional development training. I've volunteered and interned for large development organisations such as Oxfam, and I've supported education programs in places like Kenya and Nepal. So I gained my PhD in international development, and I was supervised and examined also within education, and I got that at the University of Manchester. My work looks at learning in spaces beyond schools. Specifically, I'm interested in how we learn and, an important word, unlearn about the possibilities for what society could look like. So how can we live differently? How could politics be different? What ideas do we need to learn and unlearn in order to create social change? So my PhD looked at social movements, activism, political protest, but it's the idea of learning and unlearning happening in places and spaces that are beyond schools, beyond the formal system, that I take with me and that I have brought to thinking about fire safety education. I've worked as a lecturer at the University of Manchester on master's programs in international development, humanitarian response, and on doctoral programs. And I got attached to this world of fire safety by the people. I met somebody through the University of Manchester who was involved in an organization called Operation Florian. Now, this is a volunteer organization of firefighters from the UK who has supported fire safety and response all over the world. So they've provided support, kit, PPE, protective equipment, fire trucks in places like Albania, Bosnia, Ukraine, South Sudan, places like Lebanon. And I was actually asked by the Operation Florian team to travel with them to support their Train the Trainer program, where they were working with the UN, with UNHCR, on a program of fire safety education for organizations supporting Syrian refugees. So I went out there to support that program, and as a result ended up creating networks with Save the Children to start looking at this more formally through some research. I was really lucky. I got a British Academy research grant, and I was able to develop that work in Lebanon, looking at how gender plays into fire risk in informal settlements and how to use gender and critical pedagogy to explore different approaches to fire education. So being able to apply my ideas of education to something so important, so practical, really urgent, it basically captured me. And when the opportunity came to build this at Kindling, I couldn't turn it down. So I've recently started at Kindling. I am leading the educational strategy, but I'm doing so wearing a research hat. So I think about everything from a research and delivery perspective. Rather than just going in and saying, let's do some education programs, let's do it this way, and the way it's always done, I'm thinking about and asking questions to understand, why have things been done in that way? What works? What could be better? What could we try differently? And this means using different research methods to understand the what, the how, and the why of fire safety education, so that we can evaluate, reflect, collaborate, and share. So here I am speaking to you about fire safety education from a social and critical perspective. Thank you again for welcoming me, and please again do put any questions, or if you need me to clarify anything, put things in the chat. So what does a social and critical perspective mean? At its heart, it means, how do we ensure fire safety education reaches everyone? How do we make sure fire safety education doesn't exclude people, and that the learning lasts so that behavior can change for the long term? I also think that we need to ask, how do we do education? How do we make sure it's effective, that we can achieve greater safety for everyone? So I would like you to think about those two questions which are on your screen now. What does education mean to you? And what does learning mean to you? How are they the same? And how are they different? Do they mean something different to you? So I would like you to write in the chat in Spanish or English what education might mean to you, or what does learning? Do you think there's any difference between the two? These are really important questions because they help to highlight the difference between how we think about the purpose of a formal education program and how this idea of education actually happens. So I'm going to ask everybody to just write some ideas down in the chat. And Sandra, this is where I'm going to ask you to give us some ideas and help facilitate getting some responses. So please put some ideas in the chat box.
Ok, muy bien, gracias, Helen. Nada más, nuestra comunidad, por favor, si podrían escribir en el chat qué es lo que la educación significa para ustedes y qué es el aprendizaje, qué es lo que aprendizaje significa para ustedes, si es lo mismo, si es algo diferente. Y pues esperamos algunas ideas para que podamos compartir y pues hacer alguna retroalimentación breve a Helen antes de ir adelante, ¿no? Con la presentación. Entonces, por favor, comparten sus ideas en la caja del chat. Puede ser en inglés o español, como les conviene mejor. Y te voy a pedir, Luis Enrique, que los lees, ¿no? Porque creo que justo cuando estoy compartiendo la pantalla no puedo abrir el chat en el mismo tiempo. Entonces, Luis Enrique, si me haces el favor, leerlo, sí, estaría muy bien, gracias. Y pues los que están en español les puedo traducir en inglés a Helen.
Sí, claro, con gusto. Tenemos por parte de Víctor Andrade, nos menciona, la educación son los valores que aprendemos en casa.
Education are some of the values that we learn at home.
Pablo Calvo también nos escribe y nos comenta, education for me is the lump of concept and characteristics to learn. Learning is the actual part that one individual can absorb from the education received.
Thank you.
Gracias.
De Víctor Andrade también es aprender es algo nuevo cada día.
Learning is something new every day.
A great idea to live by, definitely.
Tenemos uno más de Roberto Espinosa que nos menciona que la educación es formación de valores y adquisición de conocimientos para la vida. Aprendizaje es solo adquirir conocimientos.
Ok, Luis Enrique otra vez, primero educación, porque estará más fácil para mí.
Claro, con gusto.
Ajá.
Educación es formación de valores y adquisición de conocimientos para la vida. Aprendizaje.
Pardon. Education is sort of like acquiring values for life, essentially. And learning is, a ver, Enrique, otra vez.
Y aprendizaje es solo adquirir conocimientos.
And learning is just gaining the knowledge.
Sergio Santos nos menciona, educación es la preparación por la resiliencia.
Education is preparation for resilience.
Fantastic. So already, thank you to those of you who contributed your ideas. There'll be more opportunities later. I would love to hear some more from you. If you go to the next slide, Sandra. Thank you. So it's wonderful to hear some of your responses, because I will be referring later to one of the most important thinkers for critical and social ideas of education, who has actually kind of created the idea of thinking differently about what education can be. And it all really started in Latin America. And the idea of popular education comes from this part of the world that has a really strong history of resistance and of political action. And for me, it highlights the difference between education as being something which we see as being more formal, about gaining knowledge, and the idea that you travel through education and you take an exam and it's done. Whereas if we think about learning as being something that is dynamic, that it's always happening, that it happens in lots of different ways, different spaces, different places, that we can learn and reject, forget. We learn through trying and testing. We get things wrong, but we are engaged in a process. This is much more about fire safety learning for people, and a process of being able to be safer, and that is continuous, because as our life changes, we need to continue learning. So we want to get an understanding of why we have this dominant view of education as schooling and what that can mean for us. And so I want to think less about education and about this idea of schooling. And if you go to the next slide, Sandra. So you see here, there's a picture of Paulo Freire. He, some of you may have heard of him. He's incredibly important to thinking differently about education and to thinking differently about schooling. So if you just click first, Sandra. So the first idea I want you to think about is schooling as an idea of power. Now, my way of thinking about education and learning completely changed when I started to read Paulo Freire. He was a Brazilian educator who worked with, for want of a better word, peasant communities on literacy programs in the 1960s and earlier. Now, Freire is central for those who question the purpose and practice of traditional education, as in schools. He has been described as the grandfather of critical pedagogy. And this is the discipline within education that connects education to progressive ideas of social change that challenge the dominant forms of education and schooling. The idea that you go to school, you pass an exam, you're now educated. So my journey to Freire started when I was a high school teacher in an ordinary state school near Manchester. Many children who were disadvantaged from poorer backgrounds, and many who would do absolutely fine. They would be okay. But the government policies meant that their schooling system, the schooling system said that some of those children would never achieve. One of my students was told, "You'll never achieve anything." And I realized that this schooling system didn't value a lot of what those young people had to offer. I was working with some young people who really struggled with school, who weren't good at exams, who couldn't listen for a long time and then go into an exam room and pass a test. And I started to really question the education system that didn't see those students as being worth investing in. So in this traditional world of schooling, I was supposed to get them to pass exams, for them to sit on a seat, to listen, let me give them information, and for them to pass it, a test. I started to think, where was their independence? Where was the space for them to think differently? What if that type of learning wasn't good for them? Now, perhaps it's because I didn't want to follow the rules, but I decided to create a different pedagogy in my classroom. And if you click again, Sandra. And I created a different pedagogy. Now, pedagogy is a word you'll see a lot associated with education, but a lot of times people talk about it as what you do. And it's not just what you do, it's the values that underpin what you do. So thinking about pedagogy should mean what you do and why. Are you going to do a lecture and a quiz? Why? Do you allow students to talk and share ideas? Why? So I want you to think about how you have learnt in your time throughout your schooling or throughout your careers. How does it feel when you're taught by sitting and listening? And I struggle with giving online presentations because I want to get you to talk and to collaborate. Because I know I learn best by collaborating. How does it feel when you did get a chance to try something, to explore something, to do that with other people? Now, Paulo Freire gave me the language to explore these questions and to think about the purpose of education. And he is the foundation for how I think we should think about fire safety education. I will talk more about fire, I promise. Before I look at that more, we need to understand about Freire's social critique. So he worked with peasants, the term in all of the literature that has been written about him on literacy programs. But he didn't just teach them to read and write. His approach was all about critique and thinking. He taught these people how to think about their own lives. Why were they illiterate? Why were they poor? Why were they oppressed? Who benefited from keeping them illiterate? Who benefited from keeping them unthinking and unquestioning? Now, put most simply, there's more to it than I can say now. For Freire, the purpose of education is to become conscious of power, to understand that there are some people that want other people to stay poor and to stay illiterate. Because if you are unthinking and unquestioning, you stay silent. So for Freire, the first objective of education should be to create people who are critically conscious of the world around them so that they understand their place in it and the possibilities for change. Which leads me on to the second point of elements of Freire's work, which is action. Once we are conscious of our position, we take action to change it. Now, you might be thinking, how has this got anything to do with fire safety education? I will get there, I promise. Going back to me as a school teacher, teaching students about literature and language, I wanted to challenge the idea that the purpose of education is just to pass exams. How did I do this? I created a classroom where my pedagogy was based on compassion, collaboration, possibility. And some of you in the chat started to say it's about where you learn values. Yes, it is. And the activities that I started to put in my classroom were all about those values. I started to get my students to believe that if they had been told they couldn't achieve, they could achieve, and they would achieve, but we would do it in a different way. So this meant think differently about my pedagogy. What I did was going to be different, and it was shaped by my belief that their values and their experience and how they lived their lives is what mattered. So we used art to explore poetry, but if they couldn't draw or paint, or they didn't feel this method worked for them, we used magazines to create collages. We had debates, we used drama. They wrote letters to themselves and to me to understand their progress and to talk to me about where they needed help. And incidentally, all of my students still did very well in their exams. If you click again, Sandra. And I am going to get to fire safety education, honest. So what did I learn about doing education differently? And how does it apply now? Well, I learned about the traditional models of schooling that says, I, as the expert, I have the power, and you, as the person listening, has nothing to offer. That everything you know is down to what I tell you. So Freire talked of the empty vessel and how traditional schooling systems are based on the idea that it's up to the teacher to fill the student's brain up with knowledge. But that means the teacher gets to decide what knowledge is useful and what knowledge is valuable. There's no need for the student to question. We give them the information they need to live their lives. As an example, in a low-income community in Kenya, where I did some support for a school program, some children were allowed to take an extracurricular class on agriculture. Now, one year, a group of young female students wanted to join, but this wasn't something that had been done before. Girls doing agriculture? No, their role was to take the produce to the market and to cook it, not to grow it. Now, there are clearly some big problems here, and I found it deeply troubling. Why would you not want young women to be able to have this knowledge? Who got to decide what knowledge was important for young women? What about the young women who lived in female-headed households who felt that if they could do this agriculture course, they could actually improve livelihoods to look after their younger siblings? And I started to learn that this was an issue of knowledge and power. Who gets to decide what knowledge is needed? And what that means for the people who don't get to decide. Now, in that situation in Kenya, I saw that those decisions were based in an understanding of the role of women in society. It was also about a colonial history of what education was for, a colonial idea of what we do with knowledge in order to get a job, but only for certain people. So it meant that some people get access to some knowledge while others don't. Now, in fire safety education, this means a real world difference. It's why women, children, people with disabilities, people from marginalized indigenous groups, for example, are more likely to experience the impacts of fire. And I learned this very clearly in my work in Lebanon. So I want to delve a little bit into the idea that is rooted in pedagogy, and it's this idea of critical consciousness. And if you click again. So and I think click again, actually, sorry. So here we have this idea of conscientization. It's about learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions, and to take action against the oppressive elements of reality. So for the girls in Kenya, they said, no, we want to do agriculture. They had learned that actually the system was saying women can't do some things. This knowledge isn't for you. And they were saying, they were starting to become critically conscious that they should have that experience of doing agriculture if they felt it was important to them. So what we're doing here is we're thinking about how we have interactions with others, that we allow for criticism and discussion so that you can learn within a collective group. So we have consciousness raising activities have been so important to the feminist movement, encouraging women to share their experiences and problems and understanding their causes of oppression. Thinking about this in Lebanon and in fire safety education, it was about women learning why they didn't get access to the fire safety programs that were going in and being delivered by organizations, because they felt, and as one person told me, the men decide what knowledge we will have. So we can see there is a real life consequence for not thinking about education differently. Where communities and contexts have vulnerable groups, access to knowledge or the ability to do things differently is based on keeping those systems of inequality. And for thinking about fire safety education, we have to think how we use methods and tools that reinforce that. So as fire safety educators, what can we do that presents education in a different way? How can we use our understanding of critical consciousness to help make some people make their lives more safe? So next slide. I've presented some really big ideas there, and I'd like you to think from your first listening, what do you think a critically conscious fire safety education might look like? Or what do you think about that idea of a critically conscious fire safety education? I hope that my key ideas have come across, that I'm not speaking too quickly. If anyone wants to ask any questions before putting ideas in the chat, please do. But I'm trying to, hopefully you're thinking about how if we only follow dominant views of education, that I, expert, tell you what knowledge you need, we don't understand the way that other people live their lives, and they might need different knowledge, because I only know the knowledge I have. I don't know the knowledge that they have. So over to you, some ideas about critically conscious fire safety education. What do you think? What does it make you think about? Sandra, I don't know if you want to perhaps present the question again or translate it.
Yes, thank you, Helen. Bueno, si necesitan tal vez como una pequeña traducción, es nada más, Helen está pidiendo que pongan en el chat ¿qué es lo que piensan cuando están pensando en una educación de incendio, bueno, protección contra incendios con conciencia y con conciencia crítica? Entonces, por favor, pongan en chat otra vez, en inglés o español, algo que les representa o que les hace pensar cómo estaría esta educación en protección contra incendios, que sea consciente y que sea crítica. Algunas ideas, otra vez, están bienvenidos para compartir. Gracias. Ahora también abrí mi chat, entonces puedo ver las preguntas porque sí, al parecer se puede ver. We have Pablo Calvo. Understand the environment, local culture, and resources available, and design the course around those characteristics, beginning with the why this education is useful. Guillermo Perez, kid education on fire prevention as a way of thinking about critically conscious education. Víctor Andrade, para mí es educar desde la niñez lo que representa el manejo de cosas que representan un riesgo de incendio. For him, is to educate since childhood what does it mean to manage things that present a risk of fire. And there's a Helen, and then Joel Aguilar. The first thing to know is how fire is generated and behavior, then how to prevent fire. Roberto Espinosa, la prevención de accidentes, especialmente la prevención de incendios, debe desarrollarse desde los primeros grados de la educación formal y reforzada por los padres en el hogar. So prevention of accidents, especially the prevention of fire, should be developed from the first steps of education formally and reinforced by the parents at home. Inspecciones, alguien representante allí, es empezar desde temprana edad para llevar esos conocimientos siempre y tener en claro lo que podemos poner en práctica y en qué prevenir. So is to start really early, from an early age, to take these knowledges always so to start from an early age and be clear about how we can put it into practice and where to prevent, right? Alejandro Mendez Carreon, it's strongly necessary to create fire risk awareness at early ages, how to prevent fire starting, and to differentiate the kinds of consequences. We have a lot of ideas. It's great. It's absolutely amazing. Luis Ismael Lamadrid. Es importante que la educación contra incendio forme parte de los programas educativos. So it's important that education against fires forms part of the educative programs. Y que muchos de los problemas que se generan es por la omisión de las más elementales reglas de seguridad, siendo importante la integración de la familia en ese tema. So, and that a lot of problems that are generated by omitting some of these ideas, some of these educative programs, are the most elementary rules for security, in fact, and that they're very important to be integrated in the family, also in the theme. Jesus Alberto Hernandez de Aro, I think it should start in each person's home, but reinforced by authority. The authority does not pay attention to fire protection. Juan Ramos Bravo, consciente sería teniendo una idea de los alcances con respecto a los incendios, y crítica sería solamente teniendo mucha experiencia para poder tomar decisiones sobre cómo proteger. So consciousness should be having an idea of the reach with respect to the fires, con los alcances, or the ways that we should probably look at the fires. Y perdóname si estoy traduciendo algo mal, ¿no? Porque tampoco soy experta en eso, ¿verdad? And critics would be solely having a lot of experience to be able to take decisions about how to protect. Sergio Santos, citizenship education at school with safety programs. We have Moni Salas. Una educación consciente debe representar la realidad de cada localidad, desarrollándola desde temprana edad y siendo crítica al aceptar las áreas de oportunidad en todos los ámbitos para su mejora y adecuado aprendizaje, buscando el objetivo de la prevención y no la reacción. So education, a conscious education should represent the reality of each and every locality, being developed from early age and being critical to accept the areas for opportunity in all of the areas of opportunity, to be able to improve the education, right? Looking for objectives to prevent and not to react only, right? Sergio Santos, roles and community programs. And I guess last one, creo que por último, ¿no? Alejandro Méndez Carreón, fire education both at home and at colleges. Family as the core of society cannot elude its responsibility. Authorities having jurisdiction must reinforce fire education and work on new, better construction and maintenance codes. So I guess, you know, we can come back to them later on. Helen, I think it was a lot, right? I don't know if it's what you expected, but here you go.
Yeah, no, it's really fantastic. Thank you, everybody. So if you go to the next slide, there's some really important ideas there. And for me, I know that many of you on the call have been involved in fire safety programs, and the critically conscious view that I would ask you to think about involves these questions: who, where, when, what, and how. So we need to start thinking about how what we do might be normalized and stop access for certain people. So when I looked at some fire safety education in Lebanon, the women weren't there. The children weren't there. So I started to think about who. I started to think about where these sessions happen. If they're only in schools, what happens to the children that don't go to school? What happens to the people that don't have access to schools? If they only happen at certain times of day, what happens to if certain men are at work? Do they get missed? What are we actually telling people? Does the fire safety education include the things that is actually relevant to the way they live their lives? How are we doing it? Are we doing it in a way that says, I'm the expert, you listen, and actually it goes in one ear and comes out of the other? Because that doesn't lead to long-term change. So we need to think about those questions on their own, but also as intersecting, as connected. Who attends? When? Do we provide different information to different people? Do certain times of days work? And for me, this makes me think about a critically conscious pedagogy that questions everything about our views of education. The traditional view of education says, get a fire safety expert, stand at the front of the room, tell them everything they know, and we can tick that box. That's the cheap way to do it for governments. It's the cheap way for providers. to do it. What about if we do it differently? Because we know that actually people learn in different ways. What about if we question whether the quiz at the end of the session is just something that tests memory? I might have a good short-term memory, but I might not be able to apply it in my life at home. So we need to get fire to be a more prominent issue that's taken seriously in terms of local government, in terms of government organizations, non-government organizations, so that it's not just about having a group of quiet people in a room, but it's about people really showing that they understand about fire safety education and can apply it to their own lives. Next slide. So that means a critically conscious fire safety education for me is contextually situated. And these ideas came up in the chat. Thank you. It's contextually situated. So it's about how people actually live. It's inclusive. We think about the people that are there, but we also think about the people who might not be there. It's engaging. It's about involving people. It's problem posing. Can people apply their issues and their problems and understand them themselves, or do they rely on being told the answers and the solutions? Are there opportunities for them to collaborate? Next slide. So I'm going to show you some examples now of how I've approached fire safety education. So this is an image of informal settlement in Lebanon, and it's officially home to over 10,000 Palestinian refugees, but with many, many numbers rising every day, particularly with the influx of Syrian refugees. Now, the way that this informal settlement has been built is that new arrivals build another floor on top of an existing building, which means they get higher and higher. This is an informal settlement. There's no government support. There's no organizations working there to ensure that building codes are followed. There are no fire escapes. So I started to see that traditional approaches and the traditional content of fire safety education would not work for a group of women that I met. They couldn't build a fire escape. They didn't know what to do if there was a fire. And the question for them was, if I live on the 5th floor, how do I get my child to safety? Rather than me tell them, we worked on the problem and the solution through a discussion. And they talked about how a child wouldn't jump out of the window. It was up to them, the mothers, to get them out of the window to safety. No matter how hard it would be, that was their problem. No man had told them the solution. No man recognized that they were often at home in these buildings on their own. So we still had to address the problem. They knew that the children would hold their hands and they would never let go. So we talked and we discussed different approaches. The result, these women realized that they had to hold their child's forearm as they lowered them out of the window so that the mother would let go and the child would fall to safety. This was a really difficult conversation, but they worked the problem of an escape route themselves. And this was there's some really important things to note. I had to acknowledge and work with how people live and experience their fire risk, that it was a part of their everyday life. I had to enable them to recognize the problem of escape themselves and to realize their own way of working out how to escape. If I had just told them the solution, they wouldn't have understood it. And there's something very empowering about being part of the process of exploring the problem and the solution with people who live in the same way that you do. Freire would say that this creates new, deeper knowledge and a deeper understanding because they are part of the process of creating and finding the solution, however difficult the reality might be. The learning is felt. It's more likely to stick. We have to believe then they would be more likely to remember. Next slide. So these two images, again from an informal settlement in Beirut in Lebanon, show the everyday problem associated with electricity and living with informality in places where they don't have legal tenure, so they don't have access to, again, building codes or to electrical safety engineers and things like that. They have to find their own solutions to one problem, but unknowingly they create new problems. So by not having a knowledge of or access to knowledge around electrical safety, they realize their actions have unintended consequences. How do we educate about fire electrical safety in contexts where people have limited options? And if you go to just click on 2 slides, click and then click again. Here's another idea about approaches to fire safety education, being inclusive and collaborative. So I created a creative session with residents where they mapped their fire risk, where they lived, and allowed people to discuss how they responded to risks. We had a group of parents that used this method and mapped how and why and where fires have happened and how people responded. Children did the same things. Now, as a form of education, it was incredibly meaningful when they said to me, I have never been able to talk about my life in this way and to talk about the problem of fire safety and how they would work around it. So education doesn't have to be about imparting knowledge, about giving information. It can be about opening up spaces to share experiences, the potential to do awareness raising activities, which could lead to education about behavior change. Next slide. This slide, you'll see young people engaging in role play, theatre. They were pretending to play. And I found out through this activity that how children play with matches and what they would do in the event of a fire. We talked about stop, drop and roll and practiced ways of alerting people to a nearby fire. Next slide. Here is another form of education that I used to encourage people living in informal settlements to understand the fire problem in their tented settlements. We used photo voice, where people took photographs of where they live and how they live to talk about the risks that they see and experience. I then created a game called the Harry Monster, Harry meaning fire in Arabic. The picture that you can see in the middle is a cartoon that I drawed of the fire monster. And around the outside, the young people decided which things would feed the monster, make it get bigger, and which things would put out the monster, would kill it. And these were all things in their surroundings and features of how they lived: wood, plastic, water, wind. After every session, we ended up with mothers asking for them to be able to try it. And in one settlement, we left the game so they could do it with other people who weren't there. It was a really simple activity, but it gave the opportunity to raise awareness and get people talking about fire as an issue that they needed to be conscious of every day, but to do this in a different way. I posed the problem of, there's a fire monster here, how will we put it out? I posed the problem of fires. There are things in your environment that can create a fire monster. How do we stop that from happening? And it was a different way for them to interact. Next slide. So I realized that I've been trying to talk slowly, so I'm a little bit long on time. So I wanted to just get you to share your experiences of how do you think about who, what, where, when, and how? What do you think about what works in fire safety education? How is your fire safety education inclusive, collaborative? Are there opportunities for people to talk with each other and do we use problem posing education? So Sandra, I am aware of the time. It would be great to get some thoughts about fire safety education and what people have done and how people might use today to think about the what, why, where, how, when. But I'll defer to you for time as well.
Thank you, Helen. I think what we could do is we still ask people to contribute in the meantime while you would continue with the presentation. Is that okay? We can come back if any thoughts. Sí, les pedimos que por favor contribúen al chat con las ideas que están aquí en la pantalla mientras Helen va avanzando con la presentación, porque estamos un poquito cortos en tiempo, pero por favor nos gustaría también saber algunos de ustedes qué piensan sobre esto.
So if you go on to the next, you can skip the next slide. So the other thing it would be really great to hear is if people have some thoughts about what they might do next, if there's something you would like to try. And if you go to the conclusions, we have a long way to go. We need a lot more research on fire safety education and how we can do fire safety education differently. We need lots of different collaborations to work with lots of different partners to look at how fire safety education can be community-led and contextually situated. It involves collaboration, but it also involves being open, piloting, reflecting, revisiting, unlearning, what might we do differently. And I would absolutely love if anybody has a program that they've been doing or trialing, if you would like to collaborate in any way, I would absolutely love it. Please do get in touch. My email is at the beginning of the presentation and I'll put it in the chat. But now I would love to hear from you and thank you again for inviting me.
Thanks so much, Helen. We have a couple of responses coming in with the questions. I put in a chat, I said, what worked in fire safety education and what is next for Mexico in fire safety education? So Monica Carpio, definitely a challenge. There have been no resources to properly change what they learned. Is a risk or danger for them. Similarly, in Latin America, living in an informal settlement is not a choice most of the times. Gerardo Lopez Gorbea, early fire awareness and safety education is urgently needed in developing countries. We've got Helen, we got your email here, and Pablo Calvo is commenting that the concepts and methods shared in these presentations are great. Unfortunately, our system is based on certified instructors and instruction. That means the old-fashioned sit down and listen. We have to be more active and adaptive.
Yeah, I think, Pablo, your point is so important to understand where the current state. And the current state globally for fire safety education is sit down and listen. And yeah, if we think about what Monica and Gerardo have both said, living in an informal settlement is not a choice. Early fire safety awareness, it's needed. And in order for us to maybe push back, to resist the sit down and listen, this is where we need people who are doing it, the instructors, the certified instructors, to try one little thing in each session, one little thing that says, I did this a little bit differently, and this is the impact. And that's where we have to kind of collaborate and try new things and reflect and see how it goes. Because if we do the same thing forever, then there will always be people that will miss out. Thank you for those comments.
Thank you everyone who contributed. And thank you so much, Helen, for your wonderful presentation. It has been really great. Ahora le cedo la palabra a Luis Enrique.
Gracias, Sandra. Helen, muchas gracias por compartirnos con nosotros tu conocimiento y estos conceptos tan innovadores en relación a la educación aplicada a la protección contra incendio. A nombre de la SFP México, otorgamos el presente reconocimiento a Helen Honderheim por su exitosa participación como conferencista en el SFP México con el tema Fire Safety and Education from a Social and Critical Perspective, firmado por Sandra Bauchelite, presidenta del capítulo SFP México, y Luis Enrique Bernal, vicepresidente, celebrado el día 26 de octubre del 2022 en la Ciudad de México. Helen, recibe este presente y muy agradecidos por tu presentación.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much,
Helen.
Helen. Sorry, I'm sure you understood, Helen, what Luis Enrique was saying. We just want to kind of officially congratulate you and present you with this acknowledgement of your talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everybody who participated, and please do get in touch if you ever want to talk individually or you want to try any kind of new approaches.
Tenemos todavía abierto el chat para si quieren hacer algún comentario adicional, preguntas. Por ahí Helen también ya nos dejó su correo electrónico donde podemos tener comunicación con ella. La mayoría de los comentarios son de agradecimiento, Helen, por tu participación. Aprovecho para hacer la presentación de nuestra próxima reunión, que será el miércoles 26 de noviembre a las 10 de la mañana. Esta conferencia será en inglés y estará la ponente Farhat Binte presentando el tema Fire Safety Engineering. Espero que su participación para el próximo evento. Sería grato compartir nuevamente el espacio con ustedes. Les recordamos nuestras redes sociales donde nos pueden encontrar. Tenemos abierto LinkedIn, Twitter y YouTube. Próximamente este video que fue grabado podrán verlo, la repetición, en el canal de YouTube que tenemos con el capítulo de SFP México. Sandra, si no tienes algún comentario más, podemos despedirnos.
Sí, sería todo de mi parte. Muchísimas gracias, Luis Enrique, y muchísimas gracias para toda nuestra comunidad y Helen Underhill para su participación. Hasta la próxima.
Hasta la próxima y muchas gracias a todos los participantes. Esperemos verlos pronto en las próximas reuniones.
Bye.
Bye.
Gracias.
Directores de Revista Contra Incendio, en un entorno en el que está por definirse el 8 de octubre como el Día Nacional de la Prevención de Incendios, decidimos salir a la calle a preguntarle a la gente qué tanto conoce de qué hacer cuando hay un incendio y si reconoce la alarma. Vamos a ver qué pasó. Hola, buenas tardes, disculpa, ¿has escuchado alguna vez esta alarma?
Sí,
¿Cuál es?
la de sísmica, ¿no?
No,
¿No? Ah, no.
es la alarma de incendios.
Ah,
¿Sabe de qué es? No.
¿perdón?
¿Reconoces este sonido?
No.
¿Sabes de qué es? ¿No? ¿Tú sí las has escuchado?
Creo que sí, ¿no?
¿De qué sería?
Yo creo de sísmica, ¿no? Yo creo.
¿Sísmica qué es? ¿Tú las has escuchado alguna
No.
vez? ¿Saben de qué es?
No.
¿No?
No.
¿No?
Pues no.
Esta es una alarma de incendio. Entonces, ahora sabemos a lo mejor mucho sobre sismos y reconocemos la alerta sísmica, pero de incendios creo que no sabemos nada. ¿Usted sabría qué hacer en caso de que hubiera un incendio en su casa o en algún lugar donde usted estuviera en un negocio? ¿Lo sabría qué hacer?
No, la verdad no.
¿Nunca ha visto en las películas o en ningún lado cómo combaten el fuego?
Pues no, nada más que es correr y echarse a pecho tierra, ¿no? Por el humo, yo creo.
Pues no, o sea, solamente como el protocolo, ¿no? De mantener la calma y salir, pues, por las áreas que están marcadas.
Pues en realidad, pues yo me salgo de ahí, del incendio.
Pues correr y correr y correr.
Sería lo único.
Correr y...
Sí,
¿Qué harías?
que vienen los cuadritos estos de en caso de incendio siga estas instrucciones.
En un conato de incendio simplemente de acá salgo por las puertas, trato de ocupar una banda o un trapo con agua humedecido, salir, alejarme lo más rápidamente posible de las llamas, si se puede tomar un extintor.
Porque en los ascensores hay indicaciones en muchos de ellos. Dependiendo en qué piso estés, si estás en los pisos de más abajo, cerca de la salida y puedes salir. Y si no, es como bajarse al suelo o encerrarse en una habitación, y si tienes el del baño y si tienes oportunidad mojar una toalla o algo así y ponértela.
En caso de incendio sí, que es cerrar, tratar de tener trapos mojados, tratar de evitar que haya las entradas y salidas de aire, obviamente dar aviso.
Tratar de sofocarlo, obviamente si tenemos un extintor o algún equipo de ese tipo, dependiendo del tamaño del incendio, obviamente.
¿Creen que hace falta mayor información sobre este tema para que sepamos el ABC de cómo hacer para atacar el incendio?
Pues sí, estaría bien para que la gente esté prevenida.
Yo creo que sí. Sí, creo que sí, no abarcamos ese tema nunca.
Sí, más que nada sí debería de, ya sea en la televisión o algo así.
Pues sí, más sobre el incendio. Así como es como los sismos, también debería ser como un incendio, ¿no?
Sin
¿De mayor
duda,
información
por
sobre ellos?
supuesto, absolutamente.
Sí, digo, realmente tendría la misma importancia que un sismo, ¿no? O sea, es una situación en la cual puedes perder vidas humanas.